Hi there, my name's Katie Howard, and I am a nonprofit consultant. I run a consulting firm called KH Consulting, and I've worked with nonprofit organizations for 2 decades now, for the last 10 and a half years as a consultant to nonprofit organizations of all shapes and sizes. And as we have seen COVID-19 ravage our communities, I'm seeing an unprecedented moment in time where I wanted to reach out and find some resources to share freely with the nonprofit sector to help remind you that you're not alone. I think sometimes it can feel like legislation and responses are focused on businesses and not on the nonprofit businesses that you run. And so I had wanted to reach out to Sky, who will introduce herself in a moment, an HR consultant who will be able to share some really great expertise with all of you as you navigate these troubled times and uncertainty. So Sky, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Katie. I was so excited when you asked me to have this conversation with you. I am an HR consultant. I'm a certified senior HR consultant and a leadership coach, and I specialize in working with nonprofits all over the US. And I've been working in the nonprofit community for going on 17 years now. And, I've really had to change the focus of my services were really on recruitment and retention. And a lot of what we'll be talking about today, unfortunately, is about managing in times of crisis and furloughs and downsizing and things of that nature. And that's what I'm busy helping the nonprofit community do, as well as sustain operations.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And to those of you who are tuning in, this will be a 3-part conversation that we're presenting in 3 separate YouTubes, just so that you don't have to watch all of them straight through, or depending on your time. I know how busy you are. But this first part of our conversation will really focus on some basic HR information that Sky will be sharing with you to help you understand terms and definitions and rules and to navigate terminology and background. The second part of our conversation is really going to focus a lot more on decision making and how to make choices in these really challenging times of honestly complete uncertainty. We just don't know what's going to happen. And then for the third conversation, we're going to focus on relationships, which we'll get to when we get there. I did want to say that where I will be bringing a little bit of expertise is that most of the work I do is in fundraising, where my firm is actually really recognized as experts as grant writers, though we of course work in all other parts of fund development as well. But I'll be bringing some expertise around how to navigate those parts of the decision-making process and also the relationships that you have with your donors and your funders. So Sky, I'm going to turn it over to you really quickly for a disclaimer, and then we'll invite people to listen in on a conversation that we're going to have.
Yes. So as with all workshops that are taking place right now, we want to start with a disclaimer. So this information is up to date. As of today, April 1st, 2020, we are in an unprecedented time where things are changing on a daily basis. The other thing we wanted to note is that this isn't legal advice by any means. It's truly HR related information and fund development, fundraising, board engagement related information, not to be confused with legal advice. And, the other big thing is because so much of what's going on right now is controlled at the state level, we want to make sure that nonprofit organizations that are operating, whether it's in Washington State or outside of Washington State, that they understand that state law varies. And so it's important to have that expertise and that knowledge with regard to the specific state you are operating in.
Yes, thank you for saying that. My organization is located in Washington State, and so by default, a lot of the nonprofits I work with are also in Washington State, but I do work with nonprofits all around the country, and I'm really grateful that you have the expertise to recognize the differences between the states, and also the similarities that might come from the CARES Act and how some of those shifts might affect states the same or differently. And I guess we'll find out. So on that note, I'm going to start just by asking some really basic questions. And the first one is, I'd love it if you could explain to me the difference between a layoff and a furlough, and how that will impact my employees' unemployment insurance?
Yes. So this is a common question that I'm getting from nonprofits right now. And so I'm so glad we're talking about this. So really, a layoff is considered a temporary separation from employment. So it's an actual separation with the employee, typically given with an approximate date of when the person can expect to be recalled to employment. And it, generally speaking, most of the time, an individual is going to be eligible for unemployment in that circumstance. Whereas a furlough is either a reduction in hours on a temporary basis, or it is a unpaid leave of absence. So the person technically stays on the books. With a furlough, it's a little bit more complex. Although generally speaking, folks are going to be eligible for unemployment in general if something is related to COVID-19. There are a ton of rules in place for furloughs. For example, the state of Washington, that does a great job giving information about unemployment insurance, even says we make determinations on a case-by-case basis. And they have noted on their website something to the effect of if you're furloughed for 1 day or less a week, generally you're not going to be eligible for unemployment insurance. So the furlough is a little bit more complex. And the other thing to know about a furlough is when somebody voluntarily takes a furlough, sometimes that can impact unemployment insurance. But technically, the layoff and the furlough are really meant to be temporary measures.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Sometimes when you hear the word layoff, you think, oh no, unemployed forever and never getting my job back. So it's really helpful to hear that. And I think what I'm hearing mostly from you is that it's important to decide what the best fit is for your organization. And in part 2 of our conversation, we'll be looking a lot more deeply into decision-making approaches so that leaders can decide how to make that decision between furlough and layoff.
Yes, exactly. Because a furlough won't always make sense for every single employee, and nor will a layoff. And then, in the worst case scenario, there are organizations also doing a full reduction in force, which means that they're saying, we don't have a return to work date for you. We're going to let you go at this time. And I'm really, talking with nonprofits. Of course, every nonprofit is different, but to really proceed with caution in terms of, analyzing your employees, analyzing the situation you're in, and making the best decision for your organization. And I am hearing some organizations that are implementing furlough for certain jobs, whereas other jobs are being reduced, whereas other jobs might be laid off. So it's kind of a unique circumstance and a unique time. I think the other thing I will say for nonprofits is to make sure that when you're making the decision about a layoff, a furlough, or a reduction in force, that you're looking at not only whether or not you are able to bring the person back, not only are you looking at the unemployment benefits, but you're also looking at the job itself, not the person in the job. So it's the position that the person holds. I think that's a really important distinction. And in the toolkit that we've put together that we'll provide to participants of this webinar, we have a letter that is basically an example, a template of layoff language versus furlough language to the employee versus reduction in force language to the employee. And so it's very important that each one of those things distinguishes that you're making the decision based on the job, the position they hold, not the person.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're going to get into this in a little bit, but it just brings up this idea that our missions as nonprofit organizations are vitally important, but equally important is that if we don't have people to carry out the mission, it can be really hard to have a mission. And so We'll get into more of that later, but my next question is really about looking at exempt employees. You know, if we're thinking about how can we continue our mission at the least cost to our organization, especially for the kind of organization that perhaps has had major disruptions in our funding streams. So the question is, how can I reduce my exempt employees' salary? Or can I even do that?
Yes, this is a question I'm getting a lot. And generally speaking, you can. However, it's likely that if it is a temporary decision, that it's best to pay the employee on an hourly basis and allow them to be subject to overtime. The Department of Labor has a really good fact sheet on this, and it's the Wage and Hour Division fact sheet number 70 on FLSA and furloughs. And in that fact sheet, they talk about how, yes, you can generally reduce an exempt employee's salary based on economic hardship. However, if it's on a temporary basis or you're going back and forth, you'd be better to pay the person on an hourly basis. And so employers can always pay someone on an hourly basis. The purpose of exempt is so that employers have the flexibility and the person is exempt from overtime. So usually if you err on the side of caution that I'm going to pay this person on an hourly basis, knowing that I am cutting their hours or I'm cutting their salary, you know, each case is different, but usually that ends up being a better deal for the employee as well as a safer bet for the employer.
Ooh, that's really helpful. And it's funny because over all the years of my being a word person, I always have to Google exempt versus non-exempt. Exempt from overtime.
Yes, that's what it means. Yeah, so exempt is salaried, non-exempt is hourly. Exactly.
Yeah. So when you say that it protects the employer from risk, this is really about just making sure that our employers always follow HR law. And so you had mentioned a fact sheet. I think you said it was fact sheet 70. Are we going to be in our toolkit providing a link to fact sheets like that?
Yes, yes, we can absolutely provide that link because the Department of Labor actually puts out really good information. They have a lot of frequently asked questions. This one's a little bit tricky to find though, so I'd love to be able to provide the link and we'll do so for participants.
Oh, wonderful. Good. Well, we'll do that. All right, so my next question is a biggie, and it's about how unemployment insurance works in general, but also what does the CARES Act mean? And for anyone who doesn't know what CARES stand for, neither do I, but I know it's just kidding. I know it's the COVID response bill that passed to bring some new considerations for unemployment insurance. So to say that again, how does unemployment insurance generally work? And what does the CARES Act mean for unemployment insurance?
Yes. So unemployment is a state-run insurance benefit. Even with the CARES Act, although the federal government has given some funding to the states and they are making certain things clear of what they would like to see happen at the state level, there are still some legislative changes that are going to need to take place at the state level, and unemployment is still largely determined by the state. And so what I recommend to employees who are impacted is that they file their unemployment claim with the state as soon as possible after being impacted. And then what I recommend for the employer side is that if they are implementing a furlough, a layoff, or a reduction in force, that they give the employee the direct contact information for the unemployment office. It's very easy to get. Not only the email address, or the online application in some circumstances, but also the phone number, so that folks have that. And then really the state is going to make the determination based on the individual circumstance. For example, one common thing that comes up is employers want to guarantee that their employee is going to get unemployment insurance. Well, we all know that they likely are going to get unemployment insurance if they're laid off due to COVID. However, as an employer, you want to hesitate from making promises because you don't know if that person has another job that they could potentially be working at or earning more money at, and then the state says no to their unemployment request. So those are things that I really think are important for employers to be aware of. The CARES Act is basically federal funding that is going to allow states to waive their waiting period. In most cases, it's 1 week for unemployment insurance. It's also going to give an additional $600 per week in benefits for folks who've been laid off due to a number of reasons related to COVID. And then it will extend the unemployment insurance benefit period of time from 26 weeks to an additional 13 weeks so that people have 39 weeks in total for their unemployment. It reminds me in those ways, the additional length of time to similar legislation that was passed or extended back in around the 2008 housing crisis in that way. So that's kind of the CARES Act in a nutshell.
So just to be sure that I understand, one of my biggest takeaways was that you said, don't make a promise to an employee that you cannot personally follow through on. And since you have no control over what decisions are made at the unemployment office at your state level, don't make a promise that unemployment will for sure be granted. And then the second thing that I heard was employees will have if they're able to get unemployment insurance, if they're able to access unemployment, they'll receive $600 more per week than they would have. And they will have, what did you say, it was 12 extra weeks? No,
13.
13
yep,
extra
for
weeks.
A total
39.
of 39. Mm-hmm.
So can you just real quickly explain the $600 thing? I guess maybe what I'm trying to understand is, does this mean that people are still running the risk of not making their regular paycheck?
Right. So that's a good question. And the short answer is that each state has a different maximum weekly allowance. And so what the CARES Act has done is given an additional $600 in addition to the maximum weekly allowance. But each person's amount that they receive per week is wholly dependent upon the state as well as their own situation. So for example, in the state of Washington, they look at base months or months of employment and wages earned in order to determine how much you will receive. They have resources. State of Washington, again, does a great job putting resources on their website. I'm very impressed with what they've been doing. But if you look on their website, you can go through a complex formula of trying to determine what your weekly benefit is going to be, but you're likely going to be better off if you file the paperwork and hear back from the unemployment office so that they are determining that wage with you.
Great. So it basically means that you'll get whatever the state would have typically been able to give you under their guidelines if they approve you, plus $600 on top of that.
Up to is my understanding at this point. And the other thing too is that, and that's my understanding right now. The other thing is that the CARES Act, they're waiting for additional guidance on the CARES Act. So we just got the overview last Friday, I believe it was. And so there is going to be more coming down the pike, more guidance on how things will work, on how states will operate within the CARES Act. The one thing that I'm telling employers to do, and they will get this in the toolkit, is making sure that in their furlough layoff letters that they are stating this is due to the economic impact of COVID-19. So to make sure to document that so that then it becomes subject to these additional funds that are available. And then to, like I said, and like you pointed out, that it's important to give the employee the resource, but without saying you are eligible, because, you know, even the state won't say you are eligible. They'll say it's on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, no, that's so helpful. I appreciate that. So my next question is, what special unemployment insurance programs are there in the state of Washington right now? And then after you answer that question, let's also talk about additional information for any of our nonprofit organizations that are not within Washington state.
Yes. So Washington State has some unique programs. One is called the Shared Work Program, where if you meet certain eligibility criteria, either that program if a person has been laid off, or the partial employment program if a person's hours have been reduced, where if you work with the state as an employer, they will, and you meet the certain eligibility criteria and the person meets the certain eligibility criteria, they will waive the requirement for the person to be looking for work while they're on unemployment, because they know that the person is likely going to come back to work. So the best way to find out about different states' programs that they're offering is, I will include the link in the PowerPoint presentation that we give with this webinar, but there are unemployment insurance updates that NASWA, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but it's basically the National Association of, I want to say it's State Worker Funds or Administration or something to that nature. And they're a national association that is tracking the unemployment law updates by state. And so you'll see, like, for example, the state of Iowa just in the past couple of days raised an alert that they're no longer requiring employees to use all of their paid time off prior to being eligible for unemployment.
Oh.
So that will bring up a whole nother host of questions for folks when they hear that. But the point is that Iowa had some specific language in their state unemployment laws that they've now lifted.
Okay.
So each state has those things that are going on right now. And that's why it's so important to look at this link that we give you to go to the state that you're in directly, because they're making changes rapidly.
Yeah, this is a really good reminder, I think, right now to say to nonprofit organizations, and I really want to address just anyone who's listening in right now, just to say, hang in there. This is so overwhelming. And things are changing so fast, and you're doing such good work, and you're working so hard, and be really gentle and kind with yourself. And as much as possible, just recognize that you're not alone. And I know that it's unfortunate that we can't just give a one-size-fits-all answer to all these questions, and that we can't just give you the immediate solution. But I know Sky is an HR consultant who would be available to answer additional questions, and we'll give that contact information if you want to engage her services. And you might also have connections to other HR consultants, and so you don't have to go it alone. It can be hard to scour government websites sometimes. So this toolkit that I'm actually calling it a Helpkit that we're going to pull together will help with some of that. And then just know that you can get help, and that we're all now navigating this uncharted time together. So on that note, I did have this last question, which is perfectly timed. It seems that, with there being so many things changing all the time, and there's a lot of information out there, besides going to websites and trying to interpret rules and government language, where can nonprofit organizations go for trusted information about HR matters?
Yes, I am so glad you brought this up, Katie, because we're not all experts in every single area, right? So you're an expert in certain areas, I'm an expert in certain areas. Then there's this whole cloudy, state of affairs that we're all trying to operate in that is unique and unprecedented. And then, just recognizing that we're not all experts in everything. And it's totally okay to ask for help, because this is a complex situation. And so, for example, I'm not the best person to talk to about loans or small business loans or nonprofit loans, whereas I might be the person to talk to about HR. And so finding out whether it's a consultant externally, a board member, a trusted peer in the community that's an expert in the area, definitely rally your experts. The trusted sources that I'm going to, and these are just based on my own professional experience in HR, I always trust the Society for HR Management, and we'll include the link in the presentation that we give with this webinar, but shrm.org, shrm.org. And then the Department of Labor, like I said, they've been putting out some really good FAQs and information about the Family First Coronavirus Act, the CARES Act, and so that's dol.gov. And then This is just personal preference. There's been a lot of legal advice given out there, but I've found that the legal advice from Littler Mendelsohn, they're a law firm, and their website is Littler, LITTLER.com. They have been putting out some great FAQs and resources on things such as, if we're an essential service, how do we implement taking employees' temperatures before they come to work? How do we handle a leave of absence due to COVID-19? How do we handle unemployment? They've been doing an excellent job. So we'll include all of those links in the help kit.
Yeah, that's great. And I can also share that the National Council of Nonprofits is doing a really great job of breaking down the legislation. They just did a webinar yesterday, so that would have been March 31st, on the PPP, the Payroll Protection, I don't remember what program probably is what that stands for. That's the loan program that some nonprofits might have heard of, that nonprofits are eligible, and that I think what makes that seem like a sparkly, exciting possibility is that it has the option of being converted into a grant. So basically the loan to be forgiven. And just because you hear things like it will be a grant doesn't necessarily mean that that's something that your organization should decide to access. And so the National Council of Nonprofits, their website is councilofnonprofits.org, is a great resource for really kind of breaking it down at that high general level. And in terms of then decision making, which we're going to get into in part 2 of this conversation that we have, but decision making is really nuanced to each organization. And so we want to make sure that organizations have the reminder to, it can feel in this time of urgency to just, we want to rush and make decisions and no answers. And the fact is that while we feel the urgency as well, we also know that slowing down and recognizing when we're operating out a sense of fear or scarcity or the unknown, that can actually be a time when our risk assessment and our risk burden goes way through the roof. And so we want to calm down, we want to step back, we want to take care of ourselves. This might sound a little goofy to talk about in an HR conversation, but a technique that I always try to remember to use is actually related to my own breath, because I have really become more attuned to the fact that it's my nervous system that's at play when I'm in that state of fight or flight, when I just want to just make decisions and fight and get it done. And so elongating your exhale. So I remember always, it's not take a deep breath, it's take a deep exhale. So inhaling and then exhaling for twice as long if you can, or even 1 or 2 seconds longer, can be a way to just, when you notice that your face is getting hot, or if your heart is pounding, or if you're just feeling really overwhelmed, to do that. And slowing down in that way can help you as an organizational leader make decisions instead of reactions.
Yes, I could not agree more. And I am a big fan of breathing techniques. My favorite is the box breathing technique, where you count to 4, hold the 4, let out for 4, hold out for 4. Love that technique as well. And you're right, making sure that we're calm as leaders in this environment right now, and moving from a place of fear to a place of strategic aligned action is so important right now.
Yes. And I do also want to make note that while we both have these breathing exercises that we love, that we also recognize that breathing, it's a necessity, so please do it. But also we recognize that breathing isn't going to solve your problems. Right. But it can help support your nervous system while you try to solve your problems, or at least while you navigate problems that you don't know how to solve. So on that note, I just want to say thank you to everyone who listened in on this conversation, and we'll look forward to rejoining with you in the second part of this 3-part series. And Sky, I just want to say thank you for your generosity in sharing all of this expertise with everyone. And this help kit that we put together will include all the resources that we've talked about today, along with some contact information. So
yes, thank you for having me.